All right, chapter 13, the muscular system. In this section, we're going to do an overview of the muscular system, starting off with its functions. So there are three specific types of muscles that we're going to discuss in this chapter, but every muscle has quite a few things in common. So for example, all muscles are excitable, meaning that they can be induced to respond to stimuli. All muscles are also contractile, meaning that they can shorten. They are extensible, meaning that they can stretch. So they'll shorten and they'll lengthen. And then finally, all muscles are elastic, meaning that they can return to their original length after being shortened or lengthened. So although we're going to focus primarily on skeletal muscle in this chapter, there are two other types of muscle: smooth muscle, which we mentioned previously in chapter 4, and cardiac muscle, which we'll talk about. So what are some of the functions of our muscles? Muscles, specifically the skeletal muscles, are responsible for our voluntary movement. This allows us to move our bodies and maintain our posture. Additionally, they're going to be responsible for supporting internal organs. And they also serve a very important circulatory function in that they help increase circulation of the veins in the lymphatic vessels. So in the case of our arteries, we have our heart constantly pumping that allows the blood to flow. But in our veins, a lot of times we're fighting gravity. We're moving from our extremities back up to our heart. So to just sort of aid in that circulation, our muscles do play a very important role in that. Finally, our skeletal muscles are also responsible for generating the heat that we need to function. So like I said, there are three types of muscle tissue: smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. And the cells found in all of these tissues are called muscle fibers. We're going to break down these different types of muscles based on the structure and function of their muscle fibers. So starting off with our smooth muscles. In the case of our smooth muscles, the fibers, so the individual cells themselves, are going to be shaped like cylinders with pointed ends. So here is a slide of what that looks like, and here's sort of a drawing of what that looks like. We have sort of these long elongated cylinders, but we have these pointed ends. These are going to be unnucleated. So we're not going to see, I'm sorry, not unnucleated, uninucleated, meaning that there's only going to be one nucleus per each cell. And I know that seems a little bit obvious because when we've talked about cell structure before, we've talked about a single nucleus, but as we will see in some of our other muscle tissues, some muscle fibers do have multiple nucleuses. So it's going to be uninucleated, having only one nucleus, and they're going to be arranged in parallel lines, ultimately forming sheets, long sheets, so it's not striated. And we'll get to that in a second when we talk about some of our other muscle fibers. We are going to see this smooth muscle located primarily in the walls of hollow internal organs and blood vessels, and it's going to be responsible for causing those walls to contract, like your stomach, your intestines. The contraction of these muscles is involuntary, meaning that you do not have any conscious control over these muscles. Smooth muscle is slower to contract than skeletal muscle. It can sustain very prolonged contractions and doesn't really get tired easily. This is why you can, spend hours digesting your food and not have your stomach be sore the next day. All right, so next up we have cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is going to be responsible for forming the heart wall. So the wall of the heart that's going to be responsible for pumping that heart. Now the fibers themselves are going to be uninucleated, so once again they're going to have only a single nucleus inside of those fibers. However, the fibers themselves are going to be striated, so we're going to see these stripes along the muscle fiber, and we'll talk a little bit about what those striations are. The striated and tubular, so we don't taper down at our ends. We have long cylindrical tubes. We're going to see that they are branching in structure, so they're not necessarily just linear, but they can form large branching structures, and they interlock at intercalculated discs. Now, these are gap junctions that permit the contractions to spread through the heart wall. So if you remember when we talked about our different types of junctions between cell fibers, we mentioned that certain fibers, like cardiac muscle cell, have gap junctions, which are actually little bridges between the cells that allow for rapid communication from one cell to the next, because we don't have to diffuse across the space in between the cells. These cardiac muscles relax completely in between contractions, which helps prevent fatigue. So the muscle relaxes completely in between each pump. And the contractions of the cardiac muscle are rhythmic. They can occur without nervous stimulation, and it's ultimately going to be involuntary. There are certain things you can do to kind of help slow your heart rate down if it's going too fast. You can exercise, you can improve your diet, you can overall improve your health to help control the long-term basal heart rate, or you can do things like breathing exercises, meditations to kind of help slow your heart rate if you're too nervous and your heart rate starts to skyrocket. But largely speaking, that's not considered voluntary control. That's not really conscious control. You're consciously doing things like slowing your breathing. You're consciously doing things like maybe putting yourself in a different headspace, but you can't just say, oh, okay, heart rate, slow down. Not like you can use your arms to pick up a pencil. So it's considered involuntary control. Now, the skeletal muscle is the last type of muscle fiber that we're going to talk about. These fibers are going to be tubular, multinucleated, and striated. So we do have these stripes. We have this striped appearance in our skeletal muscle. We are going to see multiple nucleuses. We're going to see that skeletal muscle fibers can be very, very long. They'll run the entire length of the muscle. So your gastrocnemius, that very, very long muscle that you have in the back of your calf, is going to be contained or going to consist of very, very long muscle fibers that run the entire length, because those single cells are so very, very long, they're going to be controlled by multiple nucleuses. Now, these are going to be under voluntary control. You do have intentional conscious movement and control over your skeletal muscles. So the last thing we want to do is kind of break down some of the functions of those skeletal muscles. Like I said, we're going to be spending a lot of time going over skeletal muscle in this section. So humans belong to a class of animals called vertebrates. Vertebrates mean that we possess an internal vertebral column, a skeleton, and jointed appendages. Now, the skeletal muscles are going to be attached to the skeleton, and their contraction is going to cause the movement at the bones, cause the movement of bones at the joints. So the functions of the skeletal muscles are varied, but as we said, a big important one would be the movement of bones and other body structures, things like your arms, legs, eyes, facial expressions, breathing. All of that is controlled by your skeletal muscles. Your skeletal muscles are also responsible for support. Muscle contraction helps oppose gravity and allows us to remain upright. Skeletal muscles are also responsible for maintaining our constant body temperature. Contraction causes ATP to break down, which releases heat. That heat is then distributed throughout the body. As we mentioned earlier, a very important function of the skeletal system would be the movement of fluids in the cardiovascular and lymphatic systems. It helps keep blood moving in the cardiovascular veins and lymph moving in the lymphatic vessels. Also works as a protection of the internal organs and helps stabilize our joints. Muscles pad the bones, and the muscular wall of the abdomen protects those internal organs. Muscle tendons also help hold our bones together at joints. So not only does it have a protective layer, but it also has a stabilizing influence. So we're going to talk a little bit about how those skeletal muscles actually work. So we know what they do. Now we're going to learn how they do it. So for any given moment, the origin of a muscle is going to be the attachment site to the stationary bone, and the insertion is the attachment of the bone that moves. So when we're talking about muscle anatomy, we're going to be talking about origin and insertion points. So for example, here we have our triceps. The origin point is going to be up here inside of the shoulder, because the shoulder is not the one that's moving, and the insertion point is going to be down here attached to the ulna. It's going to be the push and the pull against the shoulder and the insertion point, or the ulna, that's going to allow our muscles to contract and allow that muscle to shorten. So here it's relaxed, it's stretched out, but when the arm stretches out, the tricep is going to shorten, it's going to contract. So when a muscle contracts, it's going to pull on the tendons at its insertion, and that bone is going to move. So when the biceps brachii contracts, it's going to raise the forearm. So here we have the biceps. Up here, they're going to be, the origin is up the shoulder, and the insertion is going to be down here on the radius. When this muscle contracts, when it shortens, it's going to raise the arm. It's going to move the radius towards the shoulder or towards the origin point of that muscle. So skeletal muscles are going to typically function in pairs. They aren't usually found singly, but they're going to be found functioning in pairs. One will be known as the agonist, the prime mover. This is the muscle that does most of the work. Synergists are going to help move that muscle. They're going to aid in that movement. And the antagonist is going to be the muscle that acts opposite to the prime mover. So an example of this would be our biceps and our triceps. When the bicep contracts, when the bicep shortens, the tricep relaxes and lengthens. When the tricep contracts, the bicep relaxes and lengthens. So we're going to talk just briefly about the names and actions of skeletal muscles. This I do think is a very, very important concept. If you go on to take an anatomy class, you're going to spend a lot of time naming all of the different skeletal muscles, not only naming them, but also describing their functions. So I don't want to, force you to memorize. We're not going to learn all of the different muscles. We're not going to memorize all of them. But since most of you will be taking anatomy and physiology course in the future, I do want to at least cover some of the basics of the naming, some of the naming concepts, rules, and regulations of naming these muscles. So the names of the skeletal muscles often use the following terms to characterize them. So a lot of times muscles are going to be named for their size or their shape or their location or the direction of the muscle fibers. So if you are familiar with a few of these key terms and terminology, it can greatly help you in the memorization, can greatly help you understand the different muscles you're looking at if you understand their name. So for example, some of them are going to be named based on size, like gluteus maximus and gluteus minimus. These are two muscles found in the gluteal region. One is very large, hence the maximus. One is very small, hence the minimus. So in this case, they're named based on size. There are a couple of other terms that are going to be used to indicate size, so not just maximus and minimus, but vastus is huge, longus is long, brevis is short. So when you see those terms, you should be familiar at least with what they're referencing. They're referencing very large size, very small size, very long muscle, very short muscle. Muscles can also be named for their shape. For example, the deltoid muscle, it's shaped like the Greek letter delta, so it was named the deltoid, just because of its shape. The trapezius is shaped like a trapezoid. So, some muscles are named for what they are shaped like. Some are just named for a description of the shape, like latissimus means wide, teres means round. So if you know that latissimus means wide, then you know that the latissimus dorsi is going to be a very, very wide muscle. So again, this is not something that I'm going to necessarily quiz you on, but I do think it's very important to at least review these concepts and maybe save these slides, save these definitions for when you go on to take an anatomy course, or save these definitions on a note card for when you're looking at the models of the human body, when you're looking at models of the human skeleton. All right, and we'll finish up our section in the next video.